There are some weapons in American military history that earn their reputation through sheer firepower, legendary victories, or the fear they inspire in the enemy. But then there are the outcasts, the machines that get laughed at, dismissed, and written off as failures before they ever see real combat. The M19 Gun Motor Carriage was one of those. To the Marines on Okinawa, it was a running joke, a so-called coffin on tracks that seemed more likely to get its crew killed than to win any battles. But what if I told you that this very vehicle, mocked and ignored by its own side, would become the secret weapon that turned the tide in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War? Picture this. It's 1945, and the U.S. Marines are locked in a brutal struggle for Sugarloaf Hill, a name that would soon become synonymous with death and disaster. The Japanese defenders have transformed the landscape into a fortress of hidden tunnels and sniper nests, making every inch of ground a nightmare. American firepower, artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, none of it seems to work. Every advance is met with a hail of bullets from invisible enemies. The casualty lists are growing by the hour and morale is crumbling. The hill is chewing up battalions and spitting out bodies. In the middle of this chaos sits the M19, a vehicle designed for a completely different war, a weapon that everyone says is useless on the ground. Its armor is paper-thin, its turret is wide open, and its guns are pointed at the sky, waiting for Japanese planes that never come. But here's the twist. Sometimes, the most unlikely tool is the one that changes everything. Sometimes, the weapon everyone mocks is the only one that can break the deadlock. And sometimes, it takes just one crew willing to risk everything to prove that the impossible is possible. This is the story of how a forgotten anti-aircraft gun became the hero of Sugarloaf Hill, and how American ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to accept defeat rewrote the rules of battle on Okinawa. If you think you know how World War II was won, think again. Because behind every famous victory, there's a story nobody tells, a story of desperation, innovation, and the kind of battlefield gamble that only happens when there's nothing left to lose. The M19 Gun Motor Carriage was never supposed to be a legend. But on the killing fields of Okinawa, it earned a new name, a new mission, and a place in U.S. military history that nobody saw coming. Sugarloaf Hill wasn't just another patch of ground on Okinawa. It was a nightmare carved into coral and limestone, a place where American dreams of victory collided with the harshest reality of war in the Pacific. For the U.S. Marines, the name Sugarloaf became a whispered warning, a symbol of everything that could go wrong in battle. The hill itself was deceptively small, just a bump on the map, but it was the key to breaking the Japanese defensive line. Every inch of it was paid for in blood. From the moment the first boots hit the ground, it was clear that Sugarloaf Hill was unlike any other battlefield American forces had faced. The Japanese defenders had spent months turning the hill into a fortress, digging a labyrinth of tunnels, caves, and hidden firing positions. These weren't just foxholes or shallow trenches. These were deep, reinforced chambers cut straight into the rock, invisible from the air, and nearly impossible to destroy with conventional weapons. The entire hill was alive with unseen eyes, every movement watched, every advance anticipated. For the Marines, the experience was pure terror. Every time a squad tried to move forward, a rifle would crack from somewhere above, the shot echoing off the stone and sending men diving for cover. Machine guns would erupt from cave mouths that seemed to appear out of nowhere, cutting down anyone who dared to cross open ground. The Japanese had mastered the art of camouflage and deception, using the natural terrain to their advantage. Even the most experienced American officers found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy they couldn't see. The standard tactics that had worked elsewhere in the Pacific were useless here. Grenades thrown at the caves simply bounced off the rock and rolled back down the slope, sometimes exploding among the very men who had thrown them. Flamethrowers, so effective in other battles, couldn't reach the high cave mouths cut into the cliff face. The burning fuel splashed harmlessly against the stone, leaving the defenders untouched. Even the mighty Sherman tanks, the backbone of American armored power, were helpless. Their guns couldn't elevate high enough to hit the cave openings, and their armor was no match for the deadly rain of fire from above. As the days dragged on, the casualty numbers climbed. 3 entire battalions had already been chewed up by the hill, their bodies stacked in the ravines like grim reminders of the price of every failed assault. The wounded were carried back on stretchers in a never-ending procession, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. The Marines started calling Sugarloaf Hill the meat grinder, a name that echoed the horrors of Iwo Jima and reminded everyone that some battles were won not by strategy, but by sheer, brutal endurance. Morale was collapsing. The men at the front lines were running out of hope, out of options, and out of time. Every attempt to storm the hill ended the same way, with more dead, more wounded, and the Japanese still firmly in control. The sense of frustration and helplessness was overwhelming. It felt like the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, an invisible force that could strike at any moment and vanish before anyone could fight back. Behind the lines, commanders pored over maps and reports, searching for a solution that didn't exist. The usual answers, more artillery, more tanks, more men, had all failed. The Japanese had built a fortress that seemed immune to American firepower, a stronghold that defied every tactic in the U.S. military playbook. The pressure was mounting, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. If Sugarloaf Hill didn't fall, the entire Okinawa campaign could grind to a halt, costing even more American lives and delaying the end of the war. In the midst of this chaos, one thing became painfully clear. The Marines needed a miracle. They needed a weapon that could do the impossible, reach into the heart of the hill and destroy the enemy where they hid. But as the days turned into weeks and the bodies piled up, that miracle seemed further away than ever. The coffin on tracks sat idle, mocked and ignored, while the real coffin, the one made of coral, limestone, and American blood, kept filling up, one Marine at a time. In every war, there are weapons that inspire awe and fear, machines that become legends before they even reach the battlefield. But the M19 Gun Motor Carriage was never one of those. For the U.S. Marines on Okinawa, it was a punchline, a rolling joke that seemed to exist only to remind everyone how dangerous and unpredictable combat could be. They called it the coffin on tracks, and the name stuck for a reason. Every time the M19 rumbled past an infantry position, soldiers would point and laugh, making mock funeral gestures and betting on how long the crew would last in a real fight. The open turret, the paper-thin armor, the exposed crew, everything about the M19 screamed vulnerability. The M19 was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, a mobile platform meant to protect American forces from enemy planes. Its twin 40 Bofors guns were built to track fast-moving aircraft, not to slug it out with bunkers or tanks. The armor was barely thick enough to stop a pistol round, let alone a rifle or machine gun. The crew sat high and exposed, with nothing but a thin steel shield between them and the sky. In the Pacific Theater, where Japanese air power had been all but wiped out, the M19's purpose seemed to vanish overnight. There were no enemy planes left to shoot down, and the vehicle's unique capabilities were suddenly irrelevant. To the Marines fighting and dying on Sugarloaf Hill, the M19 looked like a relic from another war, a waste of resources that could have been better spent on more tanks, more artillery, or even more ammunition. Logistics officers grumbled about the fuel it consumed, calling it a paper tank, and suggesting it would be more useful melted down for scrap. The vehicle sat idle near the beach, its guns pointed at empty sky, while its crew played cards and waited for orders that never came. Every inspection brought more ridicule, more reminders that the M19 was out of place, out of time, and out of luck. But beneath the jokes and the mockery there was a quiet frustration among the crew. They knew what people thought of their vehicle. They heard the whispers, saw the smirks, and felt the sting of being dismissed by their own side. Yet, they also knew something the others didn't. The M19 was more than just a failed anti-aircraft gun. Its twin 40 cannons could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to an astonishing 85 degrees above horizontal, almost straight up. This wasn't just a quirk of design. It was a capability that no other weapon on the island could match. While the Shermans and other tanks struggled to aim at the high cave mouths, the M19 could point its guns almost vertically, reaching angles that seemed impossible for ground combat. Staff Sergeant Raymond Miller, the M19's commander, saw the potential that everyone else missed. He spent his days reading reports from the front lines, studying the problems that plagued the infantry. He saw the frustration in the eyes of the Marines who couldn't reach the Japanese defenders hidden in the cliffs. He understood the limitations of the standard weapons and the desperate need for something, anything, that could break the deadlock. While others saw a useless anti-aircraft gun, Miller saw a tool waiting for the right problem to solve. Still, the stigma was hard to shake. The M19's reputation as a death trap was so deeply ingrained that even the idea of using it for ground support seemed laughable. Commanders dismissed the suggestion out of hand, insisting that the vehicle remain in its designated role. The official line was clear. The M19 was for air defense, nothing more. Using it against ground targets was unauthorized, dangerous, and a waste of precious ammunition. The crew was stuck in limbo, caught between the ridicule of their peers and the indifference of their superiors. Yet as the battle for Sugarloaf Hill dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, the laughter began to fade. The Marines who had once mocked the Coffin on tracks started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the answer to their prayers was sitting right in front of them. The M19 was still a joke to some, but to others, it was starting to look like the only hope left. In the crucible of war, reputations can change in an instant, and the stage was set for the M19 to prove that sometimes the most unlikely weapon is the one that makes all the difference. By the time the sun rose on the third day of fighting at Sugarloaf Hill, the mood among the U.S. Marines had shifted from grim determination to something closer to despair. Every strategy, every weapon, every ounce of American firepower had been thrown at the Japanese defenses, and still the hill stood, defiant and deadly. The Marines were some of the toughest fighters in the world, trained to adapt and overcome, but Sugarloaf was a puzzle that refused to be solved. The longer the battle dragged on, the more it felt like the hill itself was mocking them, swallowing up men and hope in equal measure. The first attempts to clear the caves had been textbook assaults, classic U.S. Marine Corps tactics honed in battles from Guadalcanal to Saipan. Squads advanced under covering fire, grenades were lobbed at suspected enemy positions, and flamethrowers were brought up to flush out defenders. But Sugarloaf Hill was different. The Japanese had carved their caves high into the cliff face, well above the reach of a thrown grenade. Time and again, Marines would hurl explosives upward, only to watch them bounce off the rock and tumble back down, sometimes detonating among their own ranks. The very terrain seemed to conspire against them, turning every attack into a deadly gamble. Flamethrower teams, usually the terror of Japanese defenders, found themselves powerless. The range of their weapons was simply too short. The burning fuel splattered harmlessly against the lower slopes, never reaching the cave mouths where the enemy waited. The Japanese, safe in their elevated positions, watched with cold calculation as American tactics failed again and again. For the Marines, it was a nightmare scenario, caught in the open, exposed to fire from above, and unable to strike back. Heavy armor was supposed to be the answer. The Sherman tanks, icons of American military might, rolled forward with their guns blazing. But the Shermans were designed for a different kind of war. Their main guns, powerful as they were, couldn't elevate high enough to target the caves. The tanks became targets themselves, drawing fire from hidden machine guns and anti-tank weapons. More than once, a Sherman was knocked out, its crew forced to bail out under a hail of bullets. The sight of burning tanks only added to the sense of futility that hung over the battlefield. Artillery barrages thundered day and night, shaking the ground and filling the air with smoke and dust. But the Japanese had dug deep, their tunnels twisting and turning beneath the surface. The shells exploded harmlessly above or outside the cave entrances, leaving the defenders untouched. The Marines could hear the enemy moving underground, shifting from one firing position to another, always one step ahead. It was as if the hill itself was alive, its veins filled with soldiers who knew every inch of the terrain. As the days turned into a blur of failed assaults and mounting losses, the psychological toll became impossible to ignore. Marines who had survived the worst battles of the Pacific began to question whether Sugarloaf Hill could ever be taken. The wounded were everywhere, their bandages stained with blood and dirt. Medics worked around the clock, their hands shaking from exhaustion. The dead were stacked in makeshift rows, waiting for burial teams that never seemed to catch up. The living moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their faces set in grim masks of determination and fear. Commanders tried everything. They rotated fresh units into the line, hoping that new blood would make a difference. They called in airstrikes, hoping that bombs could do what artillery could not. They even considered bypassing the hill entirely, but the Japanese positions dominated the surrounding area, making any advance impossible without first breaking the stronghold. Every option led back to the same brutal reality. Sugarloaf Hill had to be taken, no matter the cost. The frustration reached a boiling point. Officers argued over maps, desperate for a solution. Some blamed the terrain, others blamed the enemy, but most simply stared at the casualty reports and wondered how many more men would have to die before something changed. The Marines were running out of ideas, out of patience, and out of time. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, a heavy weight that pressed down on every man in the line. In the rear, the so-called Coffin on tracks sat idle, its crew watching the endless stream of wounded and dead with growing anger. They knew their vehicle was mocked, dismissed as useless, but they also knew that the standard tactics had failed. The M19's twin 40 guns, designed to shoot at planes, seemed like a last resort, a desperate gamble in a battle where nothing else had worked. The question was no longer whether the M19 was the right tool for the job, but whether the Marines could afford not to try something new. Desperation breeds innovation. As the Marines faced the grim reality of Sugarloaf Hill, the stage was set for a bold move, one that would challenge every assumption, defy every order, and change the course of the battle. The time for conventional tactics was over. The time for risk, for courage, and for thinking outside the box had arrived. The next chapter in the story of Sugarloaf Hill would not be written by generals or strategists, but by a handful of men willing to bet everything on a weapon nobody believed in. In the chaos behind the front lines, while the wounded were being carried back and the dead were counted in silence, Staff Sergeant Raymond Miller was quietly piecing together a solution that nobody else could see. Miller wasn't a general or a strategist. He was a crew leader, a man who knew his vehicle inside and out. He'd spent weeks listening to the jokes about the M19, the coffin on tracks, but he'd also spent those weeks reading every report that came back from Sugarloaf Hill. He saw the patterns that others missed, the elevation of the caves, the failure of grenades and flamethrowers, the way the Sherman's guns couldn't reach the enemy. Where others saw a dead end, Miller saw a gap that only his weapon could fill. The M19 Gun Motor Carriage was never meant for ground combat, but its twin 40 Bofors guns had a secret advantage. Unlike the tanks and artillery, the M19's turret could rotate a full 360 degrees and elevate to an incredible 85 degrees above horizontal. That meant it could aim almost straight up, exactly the angle needed to target the Japanese cave mouths carved high into the cliffs. Miller realized that what made the M19 a joke in one context made it a potential game-changer in another. The very design that had gotten his crew laughed at could be the key to breaking the deadlock at Sugarloaf Hill. Miller didn't waste time. He drafted a detailed tactical proposal, laying out exactly how the M19 could be used to engage the elevated cave positions. He explained the geometry, the firepower, and the unique ability of the twin 40 guns to deliver high-explosive shells directly into the heart of the Japanese defenses. He included diagrams, casualty figures, and first-hand accounts from the front lines. It was a plan born of desperation, but also of deep understanding, a plan that could save American lives and turn the tide of battle. But when Miller submitted his proposal up the chain of command, it vanished into the bureaucratic maze. The generals and staff officers, locked into their traditional thinking, saw only risk and deviation from standard doctrine. The M19 was an anti-aircraft weapon, they insisted, and using it for ground support was unauthorized, dangerous, and a waste of precious ammunition. The paperwork disappeared, the requests were denied, and the official answer was always the same: stick to the plan, follow the rules, and leave innovation to the higher-ups. For Miller and his crew, the rejection was infuriating. They watched as more Marines were cut down on the slopes of Sugarloaf Hill, as every new assault ended in tragedy. They listened to the radio traffic, the desperate calls for support, the grim reports of casualties mounting by the hour. The frustration was palpable, not just for the M19 crew, but for every Marine who knew that something had to change. The sense of helplessness was matched only by the growing anger at a system that seemed more interested in following the manual than in winning the battle. Yet even as the official channels closed ranks, word of Miller's idea began to spread among the infantry. The men on the ground, the ones who faced the Japanese guns every day, understood the value of a weapon that could reach the unreachable. They started to see the M19 not as a joke, but as a possible lifeline. The company commanders, exhausted and desperate, began to ask questions. Could the Coffin on tracks really make a difference? Was it worth the risk? Miller knew the answer. He knew that waiting for permission would only mean more dead Marines, more failed assaults, and more time lost. He also knew that innovation in war rarely comes from the top. It comes from the men who have nothing left to lose. The M19 was ready. The crew was ready. All they needed was a chance. But the generals had spoken, and the rules were clear. The M19 would remain in its designated role, pointed at the empty sky, waiting for enemy planes that would never come. The official doctrine was unyielding, and the cost of inaction was measured in American lives. For Miller, the choice was stark: obey the rules and watch his fellow Marines die, or take matters into his own hands and risk everything for a shot at victory. The tension was building, the frustration boiling over. The stage was set for a decision that would defy orders, challenge tradition, and change the course of the battle. In the crucible of Sugarloaf Hill, the line between innovation and insubordination was razor-thin. But sometimes, the only way to win is to break the rules, and hope that history will remember you not as a rebel, but as a hero. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the battlefield fell into uneasy silence, Staff Sergeant Raymond Miller made a decision that would echo through the ranks of the U.S. Marines for years to come. The official orders were clear. The M19 Gun Motor Carriage was to remain in its anti-aircraft role, far from the front lines, its guns pointed at a sky that had long since emptied of enemy planes. But Miller had seen enough. He had watched too many Marines carried back on stretchers, too many assaults broken on the rocks of Sugarloaf Hill, too many opportunities lost to the rigid thinking of distant commanders. If the generals wouldn't authorize a new approach, Miller would take the risk himself. Under the cover of darkness, Miller gathered his crew, Corporal Williams and Private First Class Torres. The three men had become a tight-knit team, bonded by the shared experience of being outsiders, the butt of every joke about the Coffin on tracks. But tonight there was no laughter. The mood was tense, electric with the knowledge that what they were about to do could end their careers or save hundreds of lives. Miller explained the plan in a low voice, his words clipped and urgent. They would move the M19 forward, threading their way through the chaos of the rear lines, past the wreckage of failed assaults and the silent rows of the fallen. Their destination, the very base of Sugarloaf Hill, where the Japanese caves loomed overhead like the mouths of monsters. The drive to the front was a gauntlet of nerves. Every clank of the tracks, every rattle of the thin armor seemed to announce their presence to the world. The Marines in the trenches watched in silence as the M19 rolled past, their faces drawn and hollow from days of unrelenting combat. There were no jokes now, no mocking gestures, just a quiet, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange vehicle could do what nothing else had managed. When Miller reported to the company commander, the officer's eyes were haunted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You want to drive that thing to the base of the cliff?" he asked, disbelief and exhaustion mingling in his tone. Miller nodded. "That's point-blank range. They'll drop grenades on you. They'll shoot straight down into your turret. You'll be dead in 60 seconds. Miller's answer was simple. "Maybe, sir, but those 60 seconds might be long enough." With a nod, the commander gave his blessing. There was nothing left to lose. At dawn, the M19 lurched forward, its engine growling as Miller guided it through a landscape scarred by days of battle. Shell craters, shattered equipment, and the bodies of fallen Marines marked the path. The crew braced themselves in the open turret, hands gripping the controls of the twin 40 Bofors guns. Every second felt like an eternity as they closed the distance to the cliff face, the Japanese defenders watching from above. The first shots rang out, a crack of rifle fire, the staccato burst of a machine gun. Bullets sparked off the M19's thin armor, pinging through the air and ricocheting off the steel. A grenade arced down from a hidden cave, exploding in a shower of rock fragments just feet from the vehicle. Still, Miller pressed on, his focus absolute, his resolve unbreakable. At 50 yards, Torres elevated the guns to 60 degrees and opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the Marines had heard before, a rhythmic, thunderous double beat that echoed off the cliffs and rolled across the battlefield. The twin barrels spat high-explosive shells in rapid succession, each round slamming into the limestone around the cave mouths. The effect was immediate and devastating. The explosions didn't just blast the openings. They shattered the very rock, sending shards of coral and stone spraying inward with lethal force. The Japanese defenders, so confident in their fortress, were suddenly under assault from a direction they had never anticipated. The M19 became the focal point of the battle. Every Japanese gun on the hill turned its sights on the exposed vehicle. Bullets rained down, grenades tumbled from above, and mortar rounds exploded dangerously close. Williams and Torres worked the guns with grim determination, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. At one point, a grenade landed in the turret compartment. Williams snatched it up and hurled it clear just before it detonated. A rifle bullet struck Torres in the shoulder, but he kept firing, blood running down his arm as he pumped shell after shell into the enemy stronghold. The psychological impact was as powerful as the physical destruction. For days, the Japanese had believed their caves were untouchable, their positions invincible. Now, the very walls that had protected them became instruments of their own destruction. The Marines, who had cowered under relentless fire, began to rise from their positions, advancing behind the M19 as it carved a path through the enemy defenses. The sound of the pump became a rallying cry, a signal that the impossible was finally within reach. As the M19 worked its way along the base of the cliff, cave after cave fell silent. The coordinated fire that had pinned down 3 battalions began to collapse, one position at a time. The infantry surged forward, using the battered vehicle as cover, their confidence restored by the sight of the Japanese fortress crumbling before their eyes. For the first time in the Okinawa campaign, Japanese soldiers began to surrender in significant numbers, climbing down from their shattered positions with hands raised, their will to fight broken by the relentless assault. By the time the M19's ammunition was nearly spent, and its barrels dangerously hot, the tide of battle had turned. Sugarloaf Hill, once a symbol of American frustration and loss, was falling, not to overwhelming force or superior numbers, but to the courage of a crew who refused to accept defeat, and the vision of a sergeant who saw possibility where others saw only failure. Miller's decision to defy orders was more than an act of rebellion. It was a testament to the American spirit of innovation, adaptability, and sheer determination. In the crucible of war, when the old rules no longer apply, it's the willingness to take risks, to challenge convention, and to trust in the capabilities of both men and machines that makes the difference between victory and defeat. The story of the M19 at Sugarloaf Hill is a story of American grit, a reminder that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from those who dare to break the mold. The moment the M19's twin 40 Bofors guns unleashed their first barrage, the entire dynamic of Sugarloaf Hill shifted. For days, the U.S. Marines had been trapped in a deadly stalemate, pinned down by an enemy they couldn't see and a fortress they couldn't touch. But now, with every thunderous pump echoing off the cliffs, the impossible began to happen. The Japanese defenders, who had believed themselves invincible behind walls of coral and limestone, suddenly found their sanctuary under siege from a direction they had never anticipated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Each high-explosive shell didn't just blast the cave mouths, it shattered the very rock, turning the fortress into a death trap for its own defenders. The limestone, weakened by years of erosion and now battered by relentless fire, began to collapse. The first cave mouth disappeared in a cloud of dust and rubble, the opening that had spat death at Marines for days now sealed by its own destruction. Williams and Torres, working in perfect sync, traversed the turret and targeted the next position. The shells walked up the cliff face in a precise line, each impact sending shockwaves through the Japanese defenses. Inside the caves, panic spread like wildfire. The defenders had been taught that their positions were impregnable, that no American weapon could reach them. But now, the very walls they trusted were exploding inward, spraying deadly fragments of coral and steel. The confined spaces amplified the blasts, turning every detonation into a maelstrom of pressure and shrapnel. The Japanese soldiers who had once fired with impunity now found themselves trapped, their confidence shattered by the relentless assault. For the Marines on the ground, the psychological shift was just as profound. The men who had spent days cowering behind rocks and corpses, afraid to lift their heads, now surged forward behind the M19. The battered vehicle became a symbol of hope, its battered armor and open turret a testament to American courage and ingenuity. The infantry advanced in its wake, using its bulk as cover, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The sound of the twin Bofors guns became a rallying cry, a signal that the tide was finally turning. The Japanese response was desperate and furious. Every available weapon was turned on the M19, rifles, machine guns, grenades, even mortars. Bullets sparked off the thin armor, grenades exploded dangerously close, and mortar rounds sent showers of rock and steel into the air. But the crew pressed on, their determination unshaken. At one point, a grenade landed in the turret compartment. Williams grabbed it and hurled it clear just before it detonated. Torres, wounded and bleeding, continued to fire with one hand, refusing to abandon his post. The M19 was battered, scarred, and running low on ammunition, but it refused to stop. As cave after cave fell silent, the coordinated Japanese fire began to collapse. The interlocking fields of fire that had made Sugarloaf Hill a killing ground were full of gaps now, gaps that the Marines exploited with ruthless efficiency. The infantry poured through the breaches, clearing out the remaining defenders and securing ground that had been untouchable for days. The psychological effect on the Japanese was devastating. For the first time in the Okinawa campaign, significant numbers of enemy soldiers began to surrender, climbing down from their shattered positions with hands raised, their will to fight broken by the relentless assault. The transformation was astonishing. The hill that had consumed battalions and seemed immune to every American weapon was now falling, not to overwhelming force, but to the innovation and courage of a single crew and their so-called Coffin on tracks. The M19, once a joke and a symbol of futility, had become the spearhead of the assault, its battered frame leading the charge up the slopes of Sugarloaf Hill. By noon, the M19's ammunition was nearly exhausted, its barrels dangerously hot, and its crew battered and bloodied. Torres was evacuated with his shoulder wound, replaced by a volunteer from the infantry who had never operated a Bofors gun in his life but was willing to learn on the job. The vehicle limped back to the rear, its tracks shedding links and its engine overheating from the sustained combat. But the damage had been done. The Japanese fortress was collapsing, the Marines were advancing, and the legend of the cave sweeper was born. The story of Sugarloaf Hill became a testament to the power of American adaptability and the willingness to challenge convention. The M19's assault didn't just break the Japanese defenses, it broke the psychological deadlock that had gripped the Marines for days. The lesson was clear. In the crucible of war, it's not always the biggest or most powerful weapon that makes the difference, but the one used with courage, creativity, and an unbreakable will to win. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle faded, the Marines looked at the battered M19 with new respect. The Coffin on tracks had become the cave sweeper, a symbol of American grit and the refusal to accept defeat. The tide had turned, and the impossible had become reality, not through overwhelming firepower, but through the vision and bravery of a handful of men who dared to defy the odds. When the guns finally fell silent on Sugarloaf Hill, the landscape was unrecognizable. What had once been a fortress of coral and limestone, bristling with hidden guns and defiant defenders, was now a shattered ruin. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of spent ammunition. Marines moved cautiously among the rubble, searching for survivors, clearing out the last pockets of resistance, and taking in the scale of what had just happened. The cost had been staggering, but the breakthrough was undeniable. For the first time in days, the American flag was raised over ground that had seemed impossible to take. The battered M19 Gun Motor Carriage limped back to the rear, its tracks damaged, its armor scarred by bullet impacts and grenade fragments. The crew was exhausted, their uniforms stained with blood and sweat, their faces marked by the strain of battle. Yet there was a quiet pride in their eyes, a recognition that they had done something extraordinary. The vehicle that had been mocked as a coffin on tracks had become the key to victory, the tool that broke the deadlock and saved countless American lives. Word of the M19's success spread quickly through the ranks. Infantrymen who had once laughed at the strange vehicle now spoke of it with respect, even awe. The nickname Cave Sweeper caught on, a tribute to the way the M19 had cleared out the seemingly invincible Japanese positions. Whenever a new stronghold was discovered, another hillside honeycombed with tunnels, another fortress that shrugged off artillery and tank fire, the call would go out. Bring up the Cave Sweeper. The sound of the twin Bofors guns became a signal that hope was not lost, that even the most entrenched enemy could be dislodged with the right combination of firepower and courage. Behind the scenes, the impact of the M19's assault was felt all the way up the chain of command. The report that landed on the general's desks was blunt and impossible to ignore. It described in detail how the twin 40 guns had achieved what no other weapon could, how their extreme elevation allowed them to engage targets that had been untouchable for weeks. It documented the psychological effect on both the Japanese defenders and the American infantry, noting the sudden wave of surrenders and the renewed momentum of the U.S. advance. The recommendation was clear: redeploy the M19s from air defense to ground support roles immediately. The generals, who had once dismissed the idea as reckless and unauthorized, quietly changed their orders. There was no public admission of error, no official commendation for Miller and his crew. But the shift was unmistakable. The M19s were pulled from their revetments near the beach and sent forward, their new mission clear. The lesson was absorbed, if not openly acknowledged. In war, adaptability is as important as firepower, and sometimes the most unlikely tool is the one that changes everything. For Staff Sergeant Miller and his crew, there were no medals, no parades, no headlines in the newspapers back home. Their reward was a quiet transfer to another unit and a whispered thank you from a company commander who would never forget what he had witnessed on the slopes of Sugarloaf Hill. The M19 itself was patched up and sent back into action, held together by welds and prayers, its legend growing with every new battle. But the true legacy of the cave sweeper went far beyond the battered vehicle or the men who crewed it. It became a symbol of American ingenuity, the willingness to see not just what a weapon was designed to do, but what it could do when the situation demanded it. It was a lesson that would echo through the rest of the Pacific Campaign and into the future of U.S. military doctrine. Never underestimate the power of innovation, and never dismiss the value of those who dare to think differently. The story of the M19 at Sugarloaf Hill is a reminder that victory in war is rarely about following the rules or sticking to the plan. It's about recognizing opportunity in the midst of chaos, about trusting the instincts of those on the ground, and about having the courage to act when everyone else hesitates. The Coffin on tracks became the cave sweeper, not because it was the best weapon on paper, but because it was the right weapon in the right hands at the right moment. As the Okinawa campaign drew to a close and the Marines prepared for the next challenge, the memory of Sugarloaf Hill lingered. The men who had survived carried with them the knowledge that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory comes down to a single decision, a moment of clarity in the fog of war, a refusal to accept the impossible. The M19's battered frame stood as a silent testament to that truth, a piece of American history forged in the crucible of battle and remembered by all who witnessed its transformation. The story of the M19 Gun Motor Carriage at Sugarloaf Hill is more than just a tale of battlefield innovation. It's a testament to the American spirit that has defined the U.S. military for generations. In the chaos of war, when every plan seems to fail and every weapon falls short, it's not always the most advanced technology or the strictest adherence to doctrine that wins the day. Sometimes, it's the willingness to see beyond the obvious, to trust in the capabilities of both people and machines, and to act with courage when the stakes are highest. For the Marines who fought and bled on Okinawa, the transformation of the Coffin on tracks into the legendary cave sweeper was a lesson written in blood and sacrifice. It was a reminder that every tool, no matter how humble or misunderstood, has a place on the battlefield if someone is willing to see its true potential. The M19 was never meant to be a hero. It was designed for a different war, a different enemy, and a different kind of fight. But when the moment came, it was the right weapon in the right hands, and it changed the course of the battle. This story echoes through the halls of American military history, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. Again and again, it's been the men and women on the ground, those closest to the fight, who have found new ways to use old tools, who have adapted to the enemy's tactics, and who have refused to accept defeat when the odds seemed insurmountable. The legacy of the M19 is not just about a single battle or a single crew. It's about the enduring power of American ingenuity, the relentless drive to overcome, and the belief that no challenge is too great when you refuse to give up. As we look back on Sugarloaf Hill, it's worth asking ourselves, how many other coffins on tracks have been overlooked in history? How many times have innovation and courage been stifled by bureaucracy or tradition? And how many victories have been won not by the generals, but by the sergeants, the privates, and the crews who dared to see things differently? The lesson of the M19 is clear. Weapons don't win wars, people do. And the people who win are those who can adapt, improvise, and find opportunity in the face of adversity. The next time you hear a story about a forgotten weapon or a dismissed idea, remember Sugarloaf Hill. Remember the crew who risked everything to break the deadlock. Remember that sometimes, the sound of victory isn't the roar of the biggest gun or the flashiest technology. It's the steady, relentless pump of a weapon used in a way no one ever imagined. So as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, if you were standing in that open turret, with grenades raining down and bullets sparking off the armor, would you have kept firing? Would you have trusted your instincts and your crew, even when everyone else said it was impossible? These are the questions that define not just battles, but the very heart of what it means to serve, to lead, and to innovate. If this story of American courage and battlefield ingenuity inspired you, don't let it fade into the background. Hit that like button and share this video so more people can discover the untold stories of U.S. military history. Subscribe for more deep dives into the weapons, battles, and heroes that shaped America's path to victory. And drop a comment below. What other overlooked weapons or unsung heroes do you want to see covered next? Your voice helps keep these stories alive. In the end, the M19's journey from Coffin on tracks to Cave Sweeper is a reminder that history is full of surprises, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one nobody saw coming. Stay curious, stay bold, and never stop searching for the stories that challenge what you think you know about America's fight for freedom.